Hi, I'm Bruen. I was Director of Global Engagement in President Obama's White House and now run the Global Situation Room, where we focus on clients' complex communications challenges. I also teach crisis communications at Georgetown University here in Washington. We talk often about counter-crisis management, and what we've seen play out during COVID-19 is really the process, the plans, and even the people that were not prepared. And I think if you dust off your crisis plan, you flip through the pages, you'll notice, especially in hindsight, that there were a lot of assumptions, there were a lot of optimistic presumptions. And now is the time for companies to take a hard look at those plans, as well as the hard realities we are now facing in a COVID and a post-COVID world. Redo those plans, stress test your people and your processes, because ultimately the nature of risk and crisis management is going to change. No longer is it sufficient simply to do an exercise or a plan once a year. This is going to have to be a living document. It is one that is going to have to be internalized by every member of your team. We talk about three. The first is you've got to identify what are your most likely and your most damaging vulnerabilities. And then against those, plan out what is the infrastructure that you would need in order to respond to the exploitation of those vulnerabilities. You build those programs, you build those pieces in place before the flood happens. The next layer is a countermeasure. What is it that you're going to deploy into that environment? Not just to respond to a crisis. I really dislike this notion of crisis response because it evokes the concept of a reset to where you were before. And one of the concepts that is challenging, I think, for a number of people to grapple with is the notion there is no reset. And we have seen this, and I think really have come to appreciate in the COVID crisis that we're not going back to where we were. So you create a countermeasure that allows you to go forward, that takes into account what is the world going to look like after that crisis, after that vulnerability is exploited. The last piece is this idea of risk indicators, measuring what you can, not just the direct indicators, but oftentimes indirect indicators that give you that early warning that a problem may be percolating. Is something you have to practice and get really good at ahead of time, because what oftentimes happens during a crisis, executives like to batten down the hatches, wall off themselves, both from customers, from stakeholders and shareholders, as well as from the public. And yet, I talk about how crises are both dangerous, but there's also enormous opportunity. You will never have more attention than in that moment of crisis for your company. And if you're not telling your story, someone else will be, and often it will be a critic. So preparing yourself, your team, your amplifiers and validators to get out and to tell that story effectively, to take control of the narrative and not fall into that defensive position. But how do you use those countermeasures to create the context in which you want to have a constructive conversation? One, you've got to run your team through more realistic stress tests and really be honest both with yourself, with your managers, and ask your employees to do the same. What are their strengths in crisis? What are their weaknesses? Some of us will really prefer to run and hide under the desk in moments of adversity. Others of us get a lot of adrenaline and we get out and really get energized by that moment. We have to understand both who we are and who our team is. Because often the weak link in the organization is someone who performs well on a day to day basis, but is not a good crisis leader. And your plans, your preparation, your process has to reflect that. If you look actually at the Mandarin for crisis, there are two symbols that make up that word: danger and opportunity. And the wisdom in ancient China was that amidst this disruption, we're seeing it play out every day where crises are creating either new opportunities for competitors or new opportunities for you. But it depends on whether or not you're able to get out amidst that storm and to really engage, because that is the X factor between companies that will thrive in adversity and those that will really suffer and have more difficulty recovering after a crisis. So you've got to, one, start with the plans that don't just look at how do we put the genie back in the bottle, but how do we actually go forward from that moment of crisis. And it's that component that is so often missing in the crisis planning because we are so focused on what we have to do to get back to where we were.